This is part 3 of chapter 31. We'll look at Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter's administration. Gerald Ford became president at the end of a very turbulent time in the nation's history following the resignation of Richard Nixon. Ford does become the first non-elected president, as he was appointed by Nixon to be vice president upon the resignation of Spiro Agnew on income tax evasion. And then, obviously, after Nixon's resignation, he became president. As Ford entered the White House, he had declared that it was a time for communication, conciliation, compromise, and cooperation. He was going to be more open with the affairs and encourage, reporters to, be more open and investigate kind of what's going on and be more informed. However, the positive mood and good feeling in Washington, as well as Ford's popular support, took a quick hit, as within a month of taking office, he pardons Nixon of any potential crimes that he may have committed during the Watergate scandal. Ford had expected some criticism due to the pardon, but he truly underestimated the widespread negative reaction of people of the United States. And then, to make matters worse, within a year of him taking office, in April of 1975, the U.S. does witness the fall of Saigon to communism, thus ending the chapter of the Vietnam War and everything we tried to do there. With Nixon's preoccupation with the Watergate scandal, he neglected the U.S. economy, and when Ford takes office in 1974, he witnesses inflation is on an 11% increase, and unemployment had climbed from 5 to over 7%. So as the United States had a stagnant economy, one that wasn't growing, and at the same time as witnessing both higher unemployment and inflation, a new term called stagflation came into being. And not since President Franklin Roosevelt had took office during the Great Depression had a new president faced such harsh economic troubles. And like Hoover before him, Ford tried to restore the public's confidence. And as Ford tried to implement his WIN program, or Whip Inflation Now, he encouraged people to save money and not spend it, to conserve on their fuel consumption, and even plant vegetable gardens to combat the higher prices that they would be buying in the stores. Now, these were voluntary programs with no real incentives, and the program quickly faded away. So eventually, as the recession the United States had entered continued to worsen, eventually Ford does encourage more direct action. However, as unemployment benefits were increased and a multi-billion-dollar tax cut was implemented, the economy never recovered, or recovered only slightly, and unemployment continued to rise to over 8% by 1975. As we look at other aspects of the Ford administration, we see that Ford kind of describes himself as conservative in fiscal affairs, moderate in domestic affairs, and international and foreign affairs. And with that said, as he looked to cut social programs, he did support an increase in defense spending and kind of ensuring law and order in the country. He also continued the policies began by Nixon of détente, and when it came to kind of being more open, as I had mentioned earlier, he also looked to restructure the CIA, and with that, he appoints George Herbert Walker Bush as its head. And even as the United States witnessed its bicentennial or 200th birthday under Ford's administration in 1976, Ford goes on to lose that presidential election to Jimmy Carter, a Democrat from Georgia. Carter had made his wealth as a peanut farmer who eventually enters politics and is elected governor of Georgia. And at first, people kind of warmed to Carter's down-home approach that he took, as they kind of liked the fact that he got out on inauguration and walked down Pennsylvania Avenue with his wife and daughter, and he was known to wear cardigan sweaters instead of business suits when addressing the nation. Carter is also remembered for, even after his presidency, as being a big supporter of human rights, affirmative action, and he supported the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, even though the states failed to ratify it. Even though there weren't a lot of bright spots in Carter's administration, one big event did take place in 1978 at Camp David, located in Maryland. At that presidential retreat in September, Carter met with the Egyptian and Israeli leaders to help bring peace to the Middle East. After 4 wars being fought in 30 years between Israel and Egypt, the Egyptian President Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Begin came to the United States to meet with Carter to discuss how to deal with the ongoing conflict in the Sinai Peninsula region, the West Bank, and on the Gaza Strip. And even over those 12 days, as negotiations almost broke down several times, Carter is eventually able to broker a deal that will set the groundwork for an eventual withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Sinai in return for Egypt opening up the Suez Canal. However, what will come to signify the failures of the Carter administration will deal with the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and what becomes known as the Iran hostages. In October of 79, the Shah of Iran had come to the United States for medical treatment, and while he was here, the Ayatollah Khomeini had led a revolt against the Shah, and the militants that he led were upset and demanded that the Shah be returned. And when Carter didn't return him to Iran, they stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 53 prisoners. And for over the 444 days that these Americans were held hostage, Carter tries different economic and political pressures to try to guarantee their release. However, as those attempts prove to fail, Carter turns to military pressure. He focuses the U.S. naval forces in the Indian Ocean, and by April of 1980, Carter authorizes a rescue mission that quickly spun into utter chaos as several helicopters broke down and had an accident which killed 8 crewmen. Thusly, the mission was called off, and Carter's futile attempts failed to secure the hostages' release. And this would mar Carter's administration and nearly guarantee he'd be a one-term president. And that's exactly what happens in 1980, when Ronald Reagan, the Republican from California, easily defeats Carter, and moments after he took the oath of office, the hostages who had been sitting on the runway in Iran in a plane ready for takeoff were quickly sent out after Reagan was sworn in. However, going back to Carter's administration and continuing the idea of the problems that he encountered, even though Carter had hoped to continue the easing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, those tensions actually heated up, and détente was actually faltering. Whereas Carter was a strong proponent of human rights, he spoke out strongly against the Soviets and their repressive regime. And things continued to grow more intense then in December of 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. About 1 month after the Iranian hostages were taken, that's when the Soviets did invade Afghanistan. And Carter took a firm stance against the Soviets and restricted trade. He also resumed peacetime draft inside the United States, and he even boycotted the 1980 Olympics, which were to be held in Moscow. But nothing would prove to be effective to get the Soviets out of Afghanistan. However, eventually, this kind of turns into their Vietnam where they'll be stuck in a quagmire for years at end before withdrawing in 1989. The U.S., in their attempt to help Afghanistan, even went as far as giving hundreds, millions of dollars to a well-known rebel today, Osama bin Laden, to help them fight against the Russians. Even when it came to domestic affairs, you can see that things really kind of created a lot of problems for the Carter administration. When in March of 1979, the nuclear power plant at 3 Mile Island, located in Pennsylvania, had a near nuclear meltdown. Throughout the 1960s, nuclear power had become more popular, and in fact 12% of our electricity in the United States came from the 72 nuclear power plants that we had. However, in 1979, with this near meltdown, over 40,000 residents in the surrounding area had to evacuate their homes. And even though there were no deaths or injuries caused by this near meltdown, it did put a halt to future nuclear power plants being built. And the question still remains today whether or not the United States should turn more towards creating more nuclear power plants to help us become more energy efficient. And through the numerous investigations and studies, it was later on determined that for the 2 million people living in the region, they actually received less radiation than what they would receive in an X-ray or a chest X-ray. So with the poor economy, the stagflation that began with Nixon and Ford and continued to cause problems for Carter, and with all the foreign issues that were engulfing foreign policy and our relationships abroad, the Carter administration was taken aback and really struggled to bring that optimistic feeling and American pride back to the United States, as we just kind of saw our power slipping around the world. But the one bright spot that did shine through took place in the Winter Olympics in 1980. Lake Placid, New York, when the Cold War played out on a sheet of ice, and these college students from the United States defeated this undefeatable team from the Soviet Union, which helped bring back some pride and kind of excitement in the United States, and will eventually be seen to kind of carry us through the election against Reagan in 1980 when Reagan comes into office.